Minodian Hecate, lovely dame of earthly, watery, and celestial frame, sepulchral in a saffron veil arrayed, leased with dark ghosts that wander through the shade. Persian, unconquerable huntress hail, the world's key-bearer never doomed to fail. On the rough rock to wander thee delights, leader and nurse, be present to our rights, propitious grant our just desires success, accept our homage, and the incense bless. Hello everybody, my name is Sorita. I'm a devotee of the Goddess Hekate, a priestess of her mysteries, an author, a publisher, slave to a fluffy white cat called Konzu, and mother to a beautiful boy, as well as a lover of books, of plants, and of good incense. So naturally, I love the Orphic hymns, and what you just heard was the Orphic hymn to Hecate, which is part of the first hymn in a series attributed to Orpheus and translated into this form by somebody called Thomas Taylor in the late 1700s. I love these translations. They are very poetic. They might not be 100% literal, but poetry and invocations, I think, works best when the energy and flow of it is also taken into consideration, as well as the literal translations. Anyway, I love it. I've been using it for probably 20 years in ritual now, and it's still part of my practice in a slightly different translation. Anyhow, I am going to be talking to you about Artemis and Hecate, two of my favourite goddesses. I absolutely adore both of them, as well as a third goddess, the goddess Diana, because these three goddesses are very closely linked in together. So I'm going to be exploring the possible reasons for these goddesses being linked together, and also what they have in common, because on the surface they might not have that much in common. I'm also just going to be babbling on a lot about Hecate because I feel that everybody should be talking about her, and today actually she is becoming a goddess that many people are exploring and looking into. She's become part of pop culture. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I'm not sure, but that opens up possibilities for people to explore and learn more, and also creates opportunities for people to research different aspects of her cult in the modern day as well as in the ancient world. The goddess Artemis had two primary forms that she was worshipped under in the ancient world. This one, which is known as Artemis of Ephesus, linked to the great temple of Artemis of the Ephesians in what is now modern day Turkey, but is on the coast of it, and it was part of Greece and Rome as well. And then the more Hellenic form of Artemis, which shows her as a young lady, and just going to put that behind her, a young lady holding a bow and arrow, and sometimes flanked with dogs, sometimes like here with a deer. So these are the two primary forms of Artemis. Hecate is best known perhaps in her triple form, where she is shown as three young women standing back to back, sometimes around a centre pillar or pole, but almost always holding objects such as torches, daggers, snakes, whips. We also see Hecate holding offering vessels like patera, plates and jugs, as well as sometimes with a pomegranate, etc. There's also keys that she's sometimes shown with, and the keys is a funny one because I sometimes get people emailing me because there's a few things like this on the internet where there's an ancient depiction and the description says Hecate is holding torches and this and a spanner, and people go, why is she holding a spanner? She's like a goddess of mechanics, you know, how does this work, you know, where does this come from? And I have to put them right. And if you've ever wondered, if you've encountered something like this and you didn't know, go and Google ancient Roman keys, ancient Greek keys in Google Images or something like that, and you'll find that those ancient keys look significantly different from our modern keys and looks a little bit more like a strange mechanical tool. So it's really not that weird when you think about it. So Hecate has more than just her triple forms. She is also sometimes shown in a single form, standing, torches, moving, implying movement because of her job as a guide and psychopomp in the mysteries, perhaps because of this link with Artemis, where she's on the hunt or on the move. She's also sometimes, but more rarely, shown in double form or quadruple form, or described in that way. Now, in addition to being shown as a young lady holding these different objects, standing side by side, sometimes with little dogs, which Artemis also has. Artemis's dogs are more obviously hunting dogs because she's the goddess of the hunt, but Hecate also has dogs by her side. Hecate's dogs are sometimes described as black dogs, but that's possibly because of the sacrifice of black puppies at crossroads, which were considered an act of purification, which may or may not have been for Hecate and other purposes. But Hecate, in addition to having the face of 3 young women when she's in a triple form, she's also sometimes described and depicted as a goddess with the heads of different animals. So here on the cover of my book from 2009 with David Rankin, Hecate Lemon Wright, we see this image by Joanna Barnum that shows Hecate with the head of a snake, horse and wolf. These are 3 animals linked to her. There are other animals that she's also said to inhabit the head of, notably a bull. She's said to be bull-faced, bull-horned, bull, shaped something. Linking her perhaps a little bit with the mysteries of Selene, the goddess of the moon as well, which she was conflated with, as was Artemis, as was Diana, the other goddess I want to talk about a little bit, because it's all mixed up together in one big kind of confusion, but at the same time it's really, really intriguing because it shows that they were part of something bigger. The other goddesses out there's a lot of other goddesses, they weren't so much linked in with these particular goddesses. So there's something going on here. They either have a same origin, they could be the same goddess, there could be a cult that developed in different ways in different regions. And it's important to know that many of the names that we have for gods and goddesses are actually epithets, which are descriptive terms. They have meaning. So it's possible that they just took on different epithets in different areas, or we can speculate a lot, but it's not going to get us anywhere because there's no absolute answer with this, even if some people would love there to be. Now, over the years, I've done a lot of research, but I have also had the pleasure and very much the privilege to speak to not just dozens, but probably hundreds of people around the world who are actively engaged in invoking, worshipping, and doing magic with the goddess Hecate today. In 2010, I edited a book called Hecate Has Sacred Fires, which is a very big book. It's bring another book up. This is like a normal size book. It's a very big, thick book. It's got contributions from 50 people from around the world, sharing their visions, sharing their stories of experiences with the goddess. So if you're interested in experiences from different people, this is a very interesting time capsule from 10 years ago, which really is, I don't know if any other book like this has been done for another goddess. So it's quite special in a way, because it's people from all over the world that mostly weren't linked or didn't know each other prior to that book. So I think it's very interesting to see how Hecate continues to inspire awe today. And my journey in learning more about her led me to understand that she's not the crone goddess, and that the crone goddess thing was something that was developed and came about in the 20th century. So within the last 100 or so years, we find that there are references to the whole maiden mother crone thing developing with Robert Graves. Probably a little bit before that there were kind of stirrings of that, but it's not something that came from a devotional aspect. It came more from a kind of analysis of things. And today it's used very much by women in women's spirituality circles for empowerment. But I personally have some questions about that, because not all women have the privilege of being maidens and then mothers and then crones, and that neat package. Women sometimes are infertile. Some women have their maidenhood taken away from them by force at a very young age, and some women become postmenopausal at a very young age because of illnesses or something, and some much, much later. And while wisdom should come with old age, and certainly we would hope that we know more and learn more about life as we get older, that's not always so clear cut. And there can be young people with a lot of wisdom as well. So I think we shouldn't kind of generalize like that. And there's some women that just choose not to be mothers, or, you know, women that are much older that still have more energy and more lust for life than other women their age, and maybe even more so than younger people. So I think it's a very complicated subject. It's a very emotional one for many people, but it's important to know that prior to the 20th century, this is not a form associated with Hecate. Maybe it's a form that she started taking on in the 20th century. Maybe it is a fabrication that is artificial, that acts like a gateway for people to explore things through. I'm not going to judge, but from a historical perspective, it's not something that is there so much. And certainly when she's in triple form, she's always the same age, okay? So it's important to know that. So when I did this big book, it led me to write a little, I'm going to hold it up so you can see the images on the cover for a while because they're beautiful. It led me to create a ritual, a devotional ritual to Hecate, in which the idea was to light a candle and say some words and just offer our devotion to the goddess. And it was intended for the contributors and other people that really helped to make this project a reality, this devotional project. And, you know, it really was a devotional project. And what happened was, in the first year, many people were so touched by this idea of doing a ritual on the same day in different parts of the world that more and more people got involved, and it was translated into, I think, 9 languages. I might be not entirely accurate there in the first year, and done by at least 2,000 people. And subsequent to that, it became a yearly celebration. I didn't know that was going to happen. It wasn't the intention, but it became a yearly celebration at the full moon of May. And much later on, I found out that there was actually a celebration to Hecate Artemis, conflation of the two goddesses, at the full moon in April-May. So it was interesting when I found that out, because it was like, wow, I didn't know that. And somehow I've developed this full moon in May ritual, which I'm sure is completely different. Completely different. Now, what's interesting, I digress, but we all like cookies. So Artemis and Hecate, the Artemis-Hecate ritual at Piraeus, which happened at the full moon of May, involved the making of small cakes to Hecate and Artemis. And these cakes were left at the crossroads, and they had small torches on them. So modern day devotees still sometimes do this. They make offerings to the goddess, they leave it at the crossroads or on their shrines with little burning lights on it, and quite often we use those tiny little birthday candles because they're just convenient and they work really, really well, you know. So you can of course make your own as well, or use larger cakes and larger candles or something like that. But I think it's quite a lovely thought. And these cakes were offered to both Artemis and Hecate. They sometimes contain sesame seeds, very much like what you still get in Greece and in Turkey and in those regions, is how I imagine them to be, like sweet cakes with sesame. Then both these goddesses had connections to the roads, they had connections as being protective goddesses, and they had roles that had them shared titles like Sorita, which means saviour. They both shared the role of torch-bearing or light-bringing, so they both have the title of Phosphorus. So Hecate very literally has these torches that she holds, and most often Hecate has 2 torches that she holds. But Artemis is also shown with torches, more often just with 1, rather than two, but Hecate is also sometimes shown with just one torch rather than two. So you get all these different kind of versions of the story as it would be. And they share other symbols in common as well. They're both shown with the polos, which is a throne, a kind of pole-like crown or hat type thing that you see on top of their heads. This is a hangover from the pole cults or the tree cults, where the goddesses were worshipped as poles or trees in near Asia. So you find it, for example, with Asherah, the goddess that's named in the Bible, and is a very significant Assyrian goddess as well. So you find this kind of thing happening where these symbols are shared. Dogs and stags and torches and snakes. They also share symbols like bees in common and bulls. So there's all these similarities. Both goddesses are closely associated with Apollo. Now, this is interesting. Artemis is considered to be the twin sister to Apollo. So she's the goddess of the new moon in later times, and Apollo's the god of the sun in later times, but they don't start off like that. They start off, both of them, with bows and arrows, shooting. Apollo becomes the god of the oracles, and Artemis becomes the goddess of the hunt and of childbirth. Primary functions, but obviously they had other functions as well. She's very wild. He's much more civilized and ordered. So these two goddesses are very close. Gods are closely associated because they are twins. There's a whole story about the birth of Apollo and Artemis, and their mother Leto having got pregnant with the god Zeus, kind of having to flee through the lands to try and escape the wrath of the wife of Zeus, Hera. When Leto gives birth, she gives birth on a little island called Ortygia, previously known as Asteria, and later known as Delos. So today you can still visit Delos. There's no people living there. It's considered sacred in some way still today. It's quite interesting. There's other places that claim the same myth. For example, the island of Ortygia, just off the coast of Syracuse in Sicily, claims to have the same mythology since ancient times, and they also have an ancient temple there to Apollo and Artemis, as well as a fantastic one to Athena, which has nothing to do with our story, which has been turned into a cathedral, but has also been a mosque and was originally a Doric temple to Athena, and it's really quite something special to go in there and still having the same space being used for continuous worship for more than 2,000 years is quite an achievement, I think. But anyway, Apollo and Artemis, twins, and the story is that Leto, having gone through this whole journey, ends up giving birth on this island. In a previous story, we have a story about the star goddess Asteria being pursued by Zeus, and she shapeshifts herself into different things, eventually turning herself into a quail, throwing herself into the ocean, where she becomes an island that is drifting because she's like this floating island. But she escapes the embraces of Zeus, she escapes him, and he then moves on to her sister Leto, resulting in Artemis and Apollo. But the island seems to be the place where Leto, her sister, then goes and gives birth. So there's this full story, and there's a strange connection to Artemis and Hecate here, where the goddess Eileithyia, who is the birth goddess that goes to attend the birth of Apollo, not the birth of Artemis, because it said Artemis was an easy birth, but Apollo was born after her, and Leto had some difficulty. The goddess Eileithyia goes to help, and many believe that that is the same as Hecate. So it could be that Hecate actually attended the birth of Apollo. It's a kind of interesting mishmash of stories, because the stories, of course, try to explain the way things are. They're not literal things. We shouldn't think of the gods as literally doing these things, because that doesn't really help. It's deeply symbolic, linked to particular places and particular cults and particular times even. So that's one connection. Hecate is also found sometimes at the thresholds of temples to Apollo on the roads, the sacred ways, in at least one very significant instance. So there's this connection, and in the regions of Anatolia, what is now southern Turkey, Hecate and Apollo were sometimes worshipped alongside each other, which you would expect to see Artemis and Apollo next to each other, but no, instead you have Hecate with Apollo. So all of that again brings this story near each other. We've also got this depiction of Artemis of Ephesus. Now, the temple of Artemis of Ephesus, today there's not very much left of it. Many people think they see it when they go to the remains of the city of Ephesus, which is a very popular tourist destination and is spectacular. Please go and see it. Don't not go and see it. And of course Artemis was present there as well, and there's even some little remains of Hecate to be seen there still, if you know where to look. However, the temple was actually outside of what is the city, that city remains today, and there's not very much there. It's ruins in a marsh, swampy piece of land where archaeologists of the 1800s created a pillar with leftover bits and bobs that they found on the site. So there's this pillar that is clearly made from different bits of a pillar, making this huge big column that is interesting but not part of the original temple. But it's worthwhile going there and at the same time familiarizing yourself with the animals and the landscapes that Artemis liked. She's the goddess of the wilderness, of the wild animals, so it's really lovely to go there in some ways because it's on the edge of the city, but there's all this wildlife there, and it's kind of given back to nature, even though it was once one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world and an incredibly important place within the ancient world and politics. It was a really important place for Christianity. And Artemis, of course, is another goddess that's mentioned in the Bible. That's just an aside, but I think some of you will find that interesting. Hecate, like Artemis, has a really ancient cult that is well established by the time that Hesiod writes his Theogony in around the 8th or 7th century BCE. In the Hesiod's Theogony, Hecate and Artemis are made to be cousins because they're mothers. As I said before, Leto and Asteria are sisters, so they're cousins. But Artemis is just given her normal roles. Hecate is given a very, very elevated role in Hesiod's Theogony. So Hesiod's Theogony talks about the great gods, and he tells the story of how the gods came and how they linked together. And he also tells the story of how Hecate comes to be born. So he says that Hecate is the daughter of the god Perseus, the destroyer, and the star goddess Asteria. So she's born from these 2 gods that have no other children. She's an only child, that's emphasized in the Theogony. And yet, somehow, Hesiod declares that in the Theogony that Zeus honours Hecate above all others. Why would the king of Olympus, the king of the gods, worship this goddess and honour this goddess above all others? That's a really interesting question, right? And it's said that he gives her splendid gifts. He honours her with a share of the earth, a share of the sea, and a share of the starry heavens. These are 3 realms that are directly linked to the Titan gods before her, and Hecate is one of the Titan gods. So one possible explanation for this generosity of Zeus is that because Hecate is not a goddess he pursues her mother, but it doesn't happen. He pursues Leto, her auntie, and obviously Artemis and Apollo result. And he pursues lots of the goddesses and mortal women and stuff in the stories, but there's no such story with Hecate that survives, at least. So we don't quite know why he honours her in this way. And one explanation is that she takes the side of the Olympian gods in the battle against the Titans, which is when Zeus comes into power, overthrowing the badness of the previous regime, if you like. But that doesn't really fully explain the situation, because many of the other gods also fight in the war and they are not honoured in this way, so it doesn't fully make sense. Another thing that Hesiod says is that Hecate is worshipped exceedingly, according to the translation, by the other deathless gods. So why are the other gods paying homage to this goddess? Because the gods don't really pay homage to many. I mean, there's a hierarchy, I guess, in some of the stories. But it's interesting. Hesiod also emphasises that Hecate is a goddess that's a child nurse, a goddess of children and the young, and that calling on her with Poseidon or with Hermes, she can bring in much success in different aspects of your life, depending on what you do. Okay, so she's described as a very benevolent goddess, and in the past people have looked at this description and gone, oh, this is a goddess of ghosts and witchcraft that doesn't fit, so it can't be right. But actually, if you look at Hecate's role in subsequent centuries, right through to texts like the Chaldean oracles, which is much later, it's in Roman period, Hecate is always given this benevolent role. It turns up again and again and again and again. It's a role that one would associate with the great goddess, and sure enough, Hecate has these close connections, not just with Artemis, but with another significant goddess from that own Anatolia Phrygian region, which is the great mother goddess Kybele, or the great goddess Kybele. Now, sometimes she's not given a name, so Kybele is convenient because that's what we know her as today. But it's the goddess that is seated on the throne, and she sits with her hands quite often out like this, with two big cats, big cat creatures, and on the sides of her throne, not always but on a very frequent basis, you'll find small depictions of Hecate and also of Hermes. These two deities frequently seem to turn up together. So Hecate has got this link to Hermes, which is not something that we really see so much for Artemis in the same way. But we find this link between Hecate and Hermes also in the Lucian mysteries, where they play the role of interceders between the world of the living and Demeter and the gods of Olympus, and Hades in the underworld and the world of the dead. Because Hecate, like Hermes, are deities that can travel between the realms. So perhaps this is why it's emphasized that Hecate has a portion of the ocean, a portion of the starry heavens, and a portion of the earth, which would include the riches and the underworld within it, probably. So it's possible that these two deities have some more significant role in the mysteries that maybe we don't fully understand just yet, because Hermes is a little bit like Artemis, that he has two very significantly different depictions. There's the depiction many of you are familiar with him standing with the caduceus, with the handsome hat and figure, and then there's also a depiction of Hermes that shows him more as like an older man in his shepherd agricultural type role, and he's also sometimes shown as a very phallic god, but he has this ability to travel between the worlds like Hecate does, so that's not something that they share in common with Artemis, okay? Not to my knowledge. Artemis is a virgin goddess, very much so. We find so many stories of Artemis defending her own virginity and the virginity of her priestesses and nymphs, that there can be no doubt about it, that it means untouched by a man. Hecate likewise is frequently described as a virgin goddess, as I've said earlier when I was talking about her as not being a crone historically. Now the interesting thing is we don't have many stories about Hecate defending that virginity, but it is something that's emphasized. So we don't have the same kind of stories that we have about Artemis. But what we do have is stories where Artemis rescues women when they are in trouble, and turns them into something linked to Hecate. So we find an example where she changes somebody into a dog that goes with Hecate, or where she turns her into Hecate or carries her off somewhere to something to do with Hecate. Both these goddesses are very closely associated with the childbed of women, and this is something that we find even with their names conflated sometimes. So there's examples going right back to the 5th century BC. So this is not modern stuff. This is not stuff that happens to be conflated when the Romans come along, who were very good at conflating and mixing things up. This is something that goes back way before that, 5th century BCE. And they were sometimes just referred to as Artemis Hecate rather than Artemis who's also Hecate, or Hecate who's also Artemis. Sometimes their names were used together and they were just thought to be the same goddess. But they also maintain this independence, and that's important, I think. Hecate replaces the goddess Selene, but Artemis also inherits some of those moon symbols and moon things. Now, what else can there be that I can say? So I don't know. I mean, I think, are these the same gods? They don't look like the same goddess to me, but it's clear that when you look at the myths that there is many significant similarities, things that we can't completely ignore. And perhaps this is what happens when we come into the Roman period and we come into the region that is now Italy, a little bit south from Rome. When we come to an area where there was a temple to the goddess Diana. Now, Diana is a goddess whose worship suddenly springs up from seemingly nowhere. She's already very popular and very important at the time that her cult centre seems to first appear in records, with very important characters making significant offerings there, which says that this is something older. It didn't start with those offerings. It's either that it was the cult of a different goddess coming there from somewhere else, or that it was something that we just don't have records of. Now, Diana is sometimes, or most often, depicted very much in this kind of way. A goddess with a hunting bow and arrows and with wild animals, a young goddess, a virgin goddess. A lot of the stories associated with Artemis become stories associated with Diana. So they look the same. They treat it like they are the same goddess. Their stories, they just change the name, and that's that, it seems to be. But it's a little bit more complicated than that, because at Nemai, which was this very significant cult centre for the Roman Diana, we find that Diana is described as a triple goddess, and that the triple goddess is specifically named as being Hecate, Artemis, and Selene, this more ancient Titaness moon goddess. So Diana is said to be composed of these three goddesses, which could be that all three goddesses was worshipped there, or that somehow the cults of these three goddesses merged there, perhaps with an Etruscan deity or with aspects of an Etruscan deity. We can't really say for certain. Diana's name just means something like divine woman. It's a very generic name. It's a little bit like saying lady in a religious context, like some Wiccans do. And Diana is really, really significant, because Diana connects these ancient goddesses coming through from, you know, the really earliest literature that we have about the gods of Greece. All through the years, we've got Artemis, we've got Hecate, we've got Selene, and they turn up everywhere, bearing light, bringing light, looking after childbirth, being there for all kinds of forms of magic, being there as major deities with their own temples, their own priesthoods, their really significant influences at different times and in different places. And then suddenly we have Diana being said to be these three gods. So it could be that those cults just were brought together, that the deities were worshipped they as separate deities, or it could be that somehow at that time, the similarity between these deities was so significantly obvious, or maybe they've just become so merged in some ways that somebody just thought they could be worshipped as the same thing. We can't really tell, and it's speculation. All of it is speculation, really, just based on research. But we know that at Nemai, the goddess was worshipped as a triple goddess. She was named as a triple goddess, and the triple goddess was explained as being those three goddesses. So they must have had the qualities. It's only later that these kinds of images became also known as Diana, but also as Artemis. They're kind of interchangeable. It's really, really confusing. But Diana would be the goddess that takes this cult forward, spreading not just within the Roman world, but continuing on in pockets through stories, through myths, through literature, through plays, continuing to inspire people, just like Hecate does, just like Artemis does. But Diana is the name that we find coming up again and again and again. Now, I've looked at some of this, and sometimes it's a bit complicated because I found at least one example where a lot of academic books refer to Diana, which I'm very interested in, and I've looked at the original Latin, and then the original Latin refers to Hecate. So we can't always trust translations. I'm sure I've sometimes got it wrong, just trusting academic works even, you know, or slightly outdated works where the translations maybe isn't 100% accurate, because there was a period where people would just translate the names. They would see Artemis and they'll say Artemis, the Greek Diana. You know, so it gets very, very confusing with these deities. It really does. So if I sound confusing, just imagine how confusing it is if you first start looking at it all. But I'm hoping I don't sound completely confusing and that I'm making it clear that it is just confusing. So Diana plays a very important role because she is named again and again in the witch trials, especially in England. Up in Scotland, you find her name linked to many of the stories of witches. The same thing continues in different pockets in Europe. We find there's references to Diana coming up again and again and again. Women worshipping Diana, you know, and also in the Balkans, there's little pockets where the stories keep on showing up in literature, just kind of in disconnected ways. You know, somebody did this, somebody did that. And it's not to the extent that you can say for certain her worship continued. What we can say is that the memory of her continued, and some of the stories and some of the superstitions of her definitely continued. And then if we fast forward right up into the late 18th century, by which point a lot of people were looking and being interested in folklore and the ancient pagan religions, we find that a man called Charles Leyland, who was a kind of travelling writer, he's an American, he spent some time in Italy, and during his time there he wrote a book. Now, this is not the only book that Leyland wrote. He wrote many books before that on all kinds of subjects, including other books on folklore and magical topics, etc. But what happens in Italy is that he is approached somewhere along the line by somebody claiming to be a witch of some sort, who presents him with a text, and he pays for the text and he publishes that text with the translation as Aradia, Gospel of the Witches. Now, Aradia, Gospel of the Witches, would become central to the modern witchcraft revival, because in Aradia, Gospel of the Witches, there's a story about how the goddess Diana gives birth to her brother, the Lord of Light, Lucifer, or sometimes Apollo. You know, there's slightly variance on the whole thing, and he's the morning star and the evening star and all this kind of stuff, and that they conceive a child, a daughter called Aradia, and that Aradia is then instructed by Diana to teach witchcraft to humanity until such days that everybody shall be free. Now, not only does this link Diana with witchcraft and the practice of magic in the late 1800s in Italy, And whether or not you dispute that that was a fake thing that Leyland either made up, or that this woman it was a hoax that she somehow made up to get some money out of him, or just to pull his legs, it seems like an elaborate hoax to me. But even if you agree that that is the case, that it was somehow a hoax, what can't be denied is that that text would give birth to so much of the modern pagan movement. Not only did it inspire people to research and look into the story, but we find as early as 1908 in a book called The Book of Witches by Oliver Maddox Hoyfer. I'm just seeing if I can see it on my shelf. It's a really old book. Oh, what have I done with it? There we go. We see in this book, my copy is very tattered, in 1908 already a reference to the fact that witches today, in 1908, was using the text of once in a month and better it be when the moon is full, which comes from Leyland's Aradia. The same text would later also be quoted in this book in the 1930s. This was a very, very popular book. Thousands of copies of this book sold. There's a book called Witches Still Live. And this was published in the 1930s by Theda Kenyon. And it's fascinating because there's all these stories about different witches, witchcraft, and spells and witch doctrines and all kinds of stuff. But this is before Gerald Gardner, okay? And I've got 2 copies of this. Let me see. I can show you the date just in case some of you are sitting there going, no, didn't happen. I think if you look very carefully, you'll see a date there. Yeah. So, what we have is a book that also claims that witches are using this text once in a month and better be when the moon is full. Again, straight from Aradia's Gospel of the Witches, Leyland's Aradia Gospel of the Witches. So a very influential text, because those of you that recognise the words I'm using, that are unfamiliar with the fact that it comes from Charles Leyland's Aradia, or maybe you already know that, might not have known that it also appeared in these 2 books and possibly in other sources that I'm unfamiliar with prior to the writings of Gerald Gardner. So it kind of indicates that something's going on, or at least people are believing Leyland and copying him in here. But these aren't those kinds of books, so it's a bit puzzling, it's a bit interesting. But certainly it inspired this idea that witches were using this text, and then by the time Gerald Gardner comes along, they create something called the Charge of the Goddess, and this first part of Leyland's text that Diana is giving and dictating to her daughter Aradia, once in a month and better be when the moon is full, then you shall assemble in some secret place and adore the spirit of me, etc., would then become part of Gerald Gardner's Charge of the Goddess. And originally Gerald Gardner would take part of Leyland's Aradia and part of Aleister Crowley's work and merge them together. And later, Doreen Valiente would come and keep the Leyland, take out the very recognisable Crowley and replace it with bits of Crowley mixed in with other texts and some of her own work to create the very beautiful, very inspirational and very, very influential Charge of the Goddess that we all love and are familiar with today. Undoubtedly, there's something that has come through from the ancient world with the goddess Diana, the goddess Artemis and Hecate, as well as Selene, that somehow continues to live on today. Their names are synonymous with some of the most famous art out there, not just in modern times, but Macbeth and Artemis is in the Bible, you know. So these are goddesses that changed the world in the past, and they're goddesses that continue to change the world going forward. So I'm out of time, and I hope that you've enjoyed this. I hope that you've learned something. And I know that it's just a rambling, but if you want to know more, you can check out my books. There's some information on my website as well as on the website of the Covenant of Hecate if you want to explore Hecate more. Thank you very, very much for listening and for taking the time and interest in my work that you've listened through right to the end. Good night.